Hello, welcome to our slideshow today on disciplinary literacy. Today we are going to get into an introduction of what disciplinary literacy is and have an overview of how it can fit into all of the subjects that we teach. After this slideshow, we're going to be getting more specific and going more into the subjects and dealing with disciplinary literacy within those specific subjects. So this is the last overview one, but there are some things that can fit into all of those subjects across the curriculums. And so we wanted to be able to gather these into an overview today too. Now, as we think about literacy within a school, there's kind of two main groups of students that we think about when we're talking about readers. There are struggling readers, and then there are students that are reading at grade level. And the way that we try to quickly separate these students so we know which students we're working with is we usually or often use a screen, which will quickly tell us which students we need to take a closer look at, who might be struggling, and it lets us know who's reading at grade level and who's doing okay, so we don't have to dig in to get more information about somebody's reading. So once we have these two groups separated, I'm going to talk about the grade level readers first. So with grade level readers, we still want to be able to put in place some balanced strategies, specifically in the secondary schools, that will increase their comprehension. So what can we do that will help them as they are trying to grasp more and more sophisticated text as they get older? And so we usually choose those strategies based on really trends that we're seeing within the class and anything that we're seeing with like vocabulary or comprehension, any sort of struggle that we're seeing, we'll choose the strategy that we're going to teach a class based off of what we're seeing from those kids. But the other thing that will influence the strategies that we're seeing is what is the discipline that we're teaching. So if I'm teaching math, I'm likely going to choose a different comprehension strategy than if I'm teaching English language arts. So with struggling readers, once we've determined who is struggling, we usually do a level A assessment, which will help us determine their reading level better, and it also helps us narrow in to figure out what their cause of difficulty is. And once we know those things, then we can still, again, choose some balanced strategies. With a struggling reader, those strategies may go beyond now just comprehension strategies. We might need to go to word recognition strategies as well, to be able to help them understand words as well as understand the bigger ideas in paragraphs. So as we're choosing strategies to work with them, those strategies are usually applied in a small group or one-on-one, and we're choosing them based on the need that's shown to us in that assessment. We're also choosing the text based on the reading level that they're at, and we usually have to increase the amount of time that we're putting in place with them. And once we have these kids being taught some strategies to be able to increase their reading skills, we have to continually monitor them. And the reason I point all this out is because as all this is happening in a school, sometimes we can think about our literacy plan too simplistically. And really, we should actually try to divide it into thinking about we have two plans going on in our school. We should have a plan of what are we doing to increase the reading level of kids who are already reading at grade level. What can I do in my class to help all of them to be able to help them understand the text of this subject better? And then the second plan would be, what are we doing with our struggling readers to be able to help close that gap so that they can better handle texts at higher levels? Now, it can seem appealing to look at this screen and say, okay, well, the right side is what the classroom teachers do, and the left side is what the inclusive ed teacher does. And it doesn't quite work that way because there's a whole bunch of things that happen that will actually make sure that the classroom teacher needs to be aware of what's going on the left side, because struggling readers, they're not going to be pulled out of classes all day long to get help. We know that they'll go get some help and then they're going to be sitting in a normal classroom for the rest of the day. And so the classroom teachers need to be aware of what's the cause of difficulty for that student. What's the level of text that they can handle? What are the strategies that they're being taught in small groups? So as I understand those things, then I can help them apply them in the classroom. But also, And more specifically here, I can help them apply those strategies to the text that I need them to understand to do better in the subject that I'm teaching. So as we move forward with our thoughts about discipline literacy here, the reason I show this screen is because sometimes it can help save some of the frustration that we can feel as teachers. It's interesting, different teachers' minds will go to different places when we talk about moving literacy forward. Some teachers, as soon as we talk about moving literacy forward, their mind goes straight to the struggling reader. What do I do to help this kid close the gap? And then other teachers' minds will go straight to, what do I do in my class to be able to help this, to help literacy move forward? And that's not the easiest thing to answer if you're thinking about what do I do in my class and you're only thinking about the struggling reader. That combination can be difficult to reconcile in your head. It should be, what am I doing in my class to help everybody read better? And if I have a struggling reader in my class as well, what specifically can I do for them to help them with what they are doing to try to close that gap? So we need to look at it separately here so that we can wrap our heads around what are we trying to move forward. So before we get too far down this disciplinary literacy discussion here, I want to stick reading into its place. So while it's actually really important that we can increase a student's ability to read, we need to remember that that is not our overall goal. Our overall goal is to be able to improve a student's ability to learn and to help them learn the curriculum of the courses that we are asked to teach them. And so while we do believe that helping a student be able to read better and understand the literacy of their courses better, then we do think that that will help them learn better. We just need to remember that what we are trying to do is to help them learn so they can succeed in life. So to say this all in a different way, what we really don't want is students just leaving our schools with the ability to read, but not understanding any of the content and the skills that our curriculums are asking them to learn. Balanced with, we also don't want them to leave school only understanding content without the ability to handle texts and understand them at a deep level, or even be able to understand them at a shallow level so that they are able to really just perform the functions of life that are going to be needed and asked of them as they leave our schools. I've learned recently how important it is to have a model of what we believe a learning environment should look like. Chinook's Edge has the quality learning environment and Westwind School Division has the ideal learning environment models. Within both of those models, the idea of learning for students and the student is at the very center. And one of the things that's around them is the curriculum and knowing our outcomes. And if our overall goal really is academically to help kids learn the curriculum, that is actually almost most important here, even before we talk about the idea of reading. Now, as I've worked with teachers over the last few years to learn some strategies to teach reading, one of the things that I've noticed is quite often we'll focus on a strategy and a teacher will learn how to apply a strategy, but when they go back to their classroom and want to focus on an outcome of learning, they don't often have a text that goes along with that outcome, or text at different levels, which is harder to do, but still an ideal thing. If we have those texts, then it's really important that we are using those texts to put them in front of kids and they get to apply their reading strategies with those texts. But if we don't have text, we can learn strategies all day long, but it's hard for us to be able to give students time to practice those texts and learn content unless we are able to find text and have them go along with what it is that we're teaching. I know many school divisions right now are working through a response to intervention or a collaborative response model framework to be able to organize some of the way that they systematize putting interventions in place for kids. I took this directly from a book about response to intervention, and they give this as a suggestion to be able to work through a curriculum to be able to fully understand that curriculum and unpack it so that we're ready to be able to know what to help students with. But I would suggest that this gets added to the end of a table so that as you're working through outcomes, you're also looking for what are the associated texts and what are the reading levels of those texts as I'm looking through my curriculum. And as you go through it and find that way you have text ready to go. So when you're teaching students curriculum and you want to be able to increase their levels of literacy at the same time, then you have some texts that are ready to go to be able to help them with that. So I'm going to stop talking for a minute here so that you have a chance to discuss. There's a couple areas that I want you to talk about for the next few minutes here. First of all, how does your school plan to both help the struggling readers and to improve the understanding of students that are already reading at grade level? So that slide that had two sides there, how do you deal with both sides of the readers that are in your school? And then after that discussion, move into the idea about and think of all the subjects in your school. Are the teachers using texts every day? And do the teachers have texts gathered that can be used to help improve student understanding of the curriculum and to improve understanding of literacy within that subject? Do we know what the reading levels of those texts are? And lastly, if we don't have it, because this is actually really a hard thing to do, to have all of these, is there anything that we can do to be able to take steps towards organizing our gathering of those texts? So once I finished going through that Advancing Adolescent Reading Initiative courses, I had a chance to come back together a year or two later with Dr. Barbara Aaron, and I got to sit down and be a part of actually redesigning those courses to try to make them as effective as possible. If a teacher wanted to go into these courses and learn them, that they would really matter to a teacher in a classroom. And not that we're going to go through each of these courses, but I just wanted to put these courses in front of you and then show you kind of how they were organized. One of the courses is almost entirely about why do we need to do this within secondary schools? Why do we need to focus within subjects? And then why do we need to have literacy run across the subjects within secondary schools? The second course was all about how do we use data? Do we know how to assess kids? And then once we have that assessment with kids, do we know how to use that data? Then there were two courses that were almost entirely based on understanding your students as learners and as readers. And if you can understand them, then you're better able to make decisions using that data that you have. And the second to last course is about the expectations of the text. So we're not even talking about strategies here yet. This was almost entirely about understanding what are the challenges that texts in different courses put in front of kids. And a lot of times we don't have them spelled out to us because we can kind of work through them without the same amount of problems because we're used to those texts. But this course was all about spelling it right out to say, here's the challenges that a math text gives kids. And it got a lot more specific than just saying word problems are hard for kids. And the last one, after all of these 5 courses, the last course was, what are the instructional practices? So now that you know why we're doing this, now that you have data about your kids and you know who your kids are and you know the challenges that the texts are giving them, now this is what you do with it. And so it's kind of hard because sometimes we want to jump right to strategies to say, tell me what to do. But it's hard to match the strategy or choose the right strategy if we don't know our kids and we don't know exactly what's being demanded through those texts. So as we delve into later courses or later slideshows here about getting more specific with those discipline literacy strategies in different areas, we will talk about those demands of texts and try to make sure that they match with the strategies that can be chosen. The one thing that's really hard through a slideshow or through something like this is I don't know your students, I don't know your assessment data. And so I will lay out the expectations of that text and say, here's some strategies, but you still have to make sure you're choosing the right ones based off of what you know about your kids so that you can be able to increase their reading levels. So I want to show you a few models of what reading comprehension actually is, or being able to read for understanding. There's a few that they become more complicated as we go along here, but they offer some insight into how to think about reading as we approach helping our students here. So this is the most simple model of being able to understand what we read. So the RC means reading comprehension equals decoding times listening comprehension. So the idea behind this is if you can decode a word and be able to figure out what that word says, and if you were to hear that word and understand it, those two things together would give you reading comprehension. Now, that is a simplistic way to do it. There's some truth to it. That oral language foundation is key. If we can comprehend things and we're able to decode, it does give us some level of understanding. Now this next one, this Scarborough's reading rope, this one gives us a more complex look at reading and how it comes together. So it actually takes word recognition, that decoding part, and breaks it down a little bit more thoroughly here to say, here's all the things that are come into word recognition, and then the comprehension and how that's broken apart. And I really like how this model shows how these skills are all wound tight so that they almost look like one thing happening. And then as word recognition and the comprehension, as that part gets wound tighter and tighter, we then have a rope which shows how well we can read, because it's all of these skills that are acquired over years that come together, and then a student is able to read fluently and understand what it is that's being put in front of them. Then we have our reading framework here, and this shows it's very similar to the reading rope actually, by showing all of the different skills broken down and how they come together. I like this one because I believe it shows the oral language foundation a little bit better. As you click on these on the website, there's more information behind them that can be able to help learn how to teach it better. But it does aim for that still, the reading for meaning at the end for kids. Now this last one that I want to put in front of you, this is actually called the RAND construct. And I really like this one because it's the only one that I've seen that actually gets to the point of what's the text. So it looks a little bit closer at what's the text you're putting in front of them and what's the activity. So why are you having kids do this? What do you want them to be able to get out of it? And so this is the idea of, so you need to know your reader, you need to know the text that you're putting in front of them, and you need to know why you're putting it in front of them and what you want out of it. And as you know, those three things together will help you as a teacher to be able to build reading comprehension in your students. This one does miss the idea of building blocks and all those things that go into it, but kind of all of these models thought of together can give us a big idea of how we can approach our students to be able to help them raise their reading levels and be able to understand the levels of text that are being put in front of them. So now we're going to get a lot more specific to discipline literacy. I just want you to know that as we look at those two plans, as we continue our discipline literacy discussion now, I am nearly entirely talking about what do we do on the right-hand side of this? What are we doing for our grade level readers to be able to help them improve their reading of disciplines? As we move into the definition of what disciplinary literacy is, I apologize here. There are some text-heavy slides coming up. I am going to break a presenting rule and actually just read what's on the slide. I apologize for this, but there's some interesting information that comes through these quotes. This one's from a guy named Alverman. He does some of the research that happens in disciplinary literacy. He's not a big name out there, but I did like this quote that he gave. He says, "Middle and high school students encounter academic discourses and disciplinary concepts in such fields as science, mathematics, and the social studies that require different reading approaches from those used with more familiar forms such as literary and personal narratives. These new forms, purposes, and processing demands require that teachers show, demonstrate, and make visible to students how literacy operates within the academic disciplines." So really the point here is we can't just rely on the English teacher to teach reading, because the demands that are being asked of in English are different than the demands that we need students to be able to do in our other classes. And so the science teacher is probably the best teacher in the school that knows how to read science texts. And so if that teacher can show students how to handle science texts, that would be what best prepares students for those texts, and the same with the other classes. We look at the different disciplines and how social studies talks about how societies work, and math talks about how numeracy works within the world. Science talks about how the physical world works, and how English talks about how we can use communication to express meaning or to understand meaning. All of those different disciplines have different roles and different ways of communicating within them, so we need to be aware of all of those. So here's one of the ways that disciplinary literacy is defined. It is unique ways of sharing information, getting people's attention, debating, responding to criticism, reporting facts, and establishing authority in a given subject area. So this comes from Shanahan and Shanahan. It's a husband and wife research team. They're kind of one of the leaders in disciplinary literacy. They talk about the idea of members of every profession have their own set of characteristic literacy practices. So when you think about those subjects and careers that come out of those subjects, we need to think about how within those careers they communicate with each other, because that's what we want to be able to prepare our students to be able to do, to be able to see how writing looks in those careers, what reading needs to be able to happen in those careers, and be able to help them prepare to be able to understand that sort of communication that's in there. Now, Shanahan and Shanahan, they actually go at it every once in a while with Allington on social media. Allington really takes that holistic approach of how to improve reading, and Shanahan are very specific to those disciplines to say, how do we actually improve the literacy practice within these disciplines? So I believe they both have a lot to offer. So you'll see both of them come up as we move through disciplinary literacy for the rest of these slideshows. Here's another example of how literacy in different subjects can look different. For example, some kinds of details matter more when you're reading in history than it does in chemistry. In chemistry, we don't always really need to know exactly when a discovery of a specific type of chemical or an element was discovered. But knowing when an event occurred and in what order through a social studies class might make much more of a difference. And so when a student is reading through a text, one teacher might need to emphasize dates a lot more than another teacher. So when we think about the development of literacy skills within our students, it goes through 3 stages here: basic literacy, intermediate literacy, and disciplinary literacy. This is kind of a different way of looking at our reading framework. Our reading framework talks about going through reading readiness, word recognition, and then building on that with a comprehension. And word recognition and comprehension can't really be separated. They kind of come together. But the idea of basic literacy is kids learn that reading readiness, they learn word recognition, and they start into that comprehension. Intermediate is, do they have comprehension skills that can cross through all of the disciplines through subjects? And if you think about back when we talked about tiered vocabulary words, the tier 1, 2, 3, tier 1 was the really common words. Tier 2 was those academic words that would cross between subjects, and tier 3 was very subject specific. So disciplinary literacy is kind of like that tier 3 vocabulary, where as we talk about learning the literacy of specific subjects, it is very much the idea of how does literacy in science differ from literacy in social studies, which differs from literacy in math? What makes literacy in science that way? So when you look at careers that come out of the subject that you're teaching, how do those careers communicate differently than careers that come out of different subjects? And are we helping students to be able to understand those methods of communication so that they can be able to master the idea of communicating within the subject that you're teaching? I recently saw a video that made me wonder about how my own thinking was getting in my own way. I want to show you this video as we continue our discussion about moving into disciplinary literacy. There is a spot in this video where he asks you to make a guess about something. I'd ask that whoever is running the show right now, that when you get to that spot in the video, that you would actually press pause and allow everyone in the room to make their guess before you continue.
I spend most of my waking hours thinking about possibility, because potential is about possibility. All of us know how good we become, none of us know how good we could be. And what I'd like you to do right now, since almost everyone in the room either has ridden or currently does ride a bicycle, I would like you to just turn to the person next to you and share the answer to this question. How fast do you think it's possible to ride a bicycle? Just take 20 seconds, turn to the person next to you, and miles per hour, how fast do you think it is possible to ride a bicycle? All right, let me get your attention back. Now I want you to keep in mind the number, the miles per hour that you chose and the miles per hour that your colleague chose. Because I'm not clairvoyant. I wish I was one of those people that could pick someone at random and say, this is the number you chose. I don't know what number you chose, but I know how you chose the number. You thought backwards. See, whenever somebody says what's possible, you think about what's probable. Whenever somebody says what's possible for next year's sales, you think about last year's sales. So if you've ridden a bicycle to a speed of 20 miles an hour, you might have doubled it and thought 40 miles an hour. And if you watch the Tour de France on TV, you see them coming down out of the mountains on skinny, tired bicycles. They're doing 60, sometimes approaching 70 miles an hour. But you say, hey, Mark, that's gravity. That's really not under their own power. So what's possible? 1985. 3-time retired U.S. Olympic athlete John Howard was at the Bonneville Salt Flats. It was July 20th, 1985, and John was there to answer the question, how fast can a human being ride a bicycle? Now, he was not riding your dad's Schwinn. He was riding a specially built bike. One turn of the pedals, one revolution of the crankshaft moved the bike about 110 feet. severely geared bicycle. They monitored his heart rate, and at peak, he was sustaining a heart rate of 195 beats per minute. For many of us in the room, that would induce massive coronary. And he set a land speed record, and I want you to check your number against John's, because John rode a bike to a speed of 152.2 miles per hour. Anybody guess 152? By the way, if you'd guessed 152, regrettably you'd be wrong, because in 1996 a European achieved a speed of 166 miles an hour. We all know what is probable, none of us know what is possible. We don't know physiologically, we don't know psychologically, we don't know organizationally, and I don't care how big your imagination is. You can't begin to estimate the true potential, the true possibility that you have here at Henry Schein Dental.
Now, some of you might be wondering, what does this have to do with disciplinary literacy? I actually show this video just because the more we get into disciplinary literacy, the more it's actually not just a slight tweak on just adding in something that we're doing to teach, to be able to like, okay, if I do this, then I can start teaching literacy more. It's almost a rearrangement of how we think about including texts and language into our teaching. And it's not to say by any means that if we haven't been doing that, we've been teaching wrong or anything like that. And I actually think a lot of us have been doing this without knowing about how important language is. But as we can take kids and be able to increase their use of language and increase their use of higher level literacies in class, then they'll be able to understand text more. And as we give them more opportunities to use text in class, then they'll be able to understand them better. So it's not necessarily about the idea of just doing a quick add-in. It is about doing a rearrangement of our thinking. And I liked his ideas about shifting thinking, so I wanted to put that in there. So in case I haven't already been clear enough about this, or if I haven't said it in the right way, I'm going to say this one more time here. When I first started learning about literacy and including reading within teaching in the secondary schools, this is the way I thought about it. I thought about content area reading. I would think about, how can I teach reading using science? How can I teach reading using social studies? And as we got into this disciplinary literacy, it shifted my thinking. And this is the way that we should look at it now, because rather than thinking about teaching reading using the subject area, we want disciplinary literacy to more be about, how do we teach the subject by focusing on the literacy or the language demands that that subject is asking our kids to be able to do? How do we help our kids handle our subjects better? Another way to look at that too is, rather than thinking about doing literacy in science, doing literacy in math or history or literature, we want to shift it to think about, what is the literacy of science? What is the literacy of math? And how do we help our kids understand those? We often think about the idea of learning to read up to grade 3, and then after that, reading to learn. But we need to shift that thinking more over to the idea of learning to read is actually going to include the idea of, how do we learn texts of different disciplines so that we can learn all of the content across the curriculums. Here's a few more quotes from Shanahan and Shanahan. The goal of content area instruction is to introduce students to the ways in which experts in the core academic disciplines look at the world, investigate it, and communicate to one another about what they see and learn. To become competent in a number of academic content areas requires more than just applying the same skills and comprehension strategies to new kinds of texts. It requires skills and knowledge and reasoning processes that are specific to particular academic disciplines. Although most students manage to master basic and even intermediate literacy skills, many may never gain proficiency with the more advanced skills that would enable them to read challenging texts in science, history, literature, mathematics, or technology. So coming back to this comparison that Dr. Barbara Aaron makes about disciplinary literacy with being in Europe and the idea of moving from one language to another, I hope this makes a little bit more sense now as we go through this, about how when a student is in math for the first period of the day and then the bell rings and they switch, it's almost like being in France and switching to Germany after the bell rings, because now they're speaking a whole different language and using a whole different way to communicate. So I'm going to stop talking again now, and I'd like you to, in your groups, discuss these questions. How is focusing on teaching curriculum using reading and literacy different from teaching reading using the curriculum? And how can that impact the teaching? And the second question is, how are texts different from subject to subject? So think about the common forms of text in those subjects and think about the language used in those texts. Those differences between texts in the different subjects, or the demands of different subject texts, we'll actually embed those into the upcoming slideshows so you can see more specifically what those are rather than just having a conversation about it. So with that, as we talk about those foundations of literacy instruction now, I want to put the framework and this pyramid back in front of you that show how disciplinary literacy is really on top of everything else. And the reason I put these two together is because sometimes we use the idea of a reading skill and a reading strategy, and we interchange those terms. And so as we talk about being able to build reading skills in kids, the idea that we want to give kids strategies so that they can practice those strategies in order to build their skills. I have a handout here now that I'm going to stop so that you can go through this handout. And as you go through the handout, I'm hoping that it becomes obvious to you what the difference between a skill and a strategy is. And there's different kids within this handout. I want you to take a look at which one of these is a skillful reader and which one of these is a strategic reader. And then after you've read it, answer these questions: is what is the difference between a reading skill and a reading strategy? And what is a teacher's goal when they are working on a reading strategy? At the end of that conversation, I do hope that part of your conversation got to the point of saying that a strategy is not exactly what the teacher does. It's not the teaching strategy. A reading strategy is actually something that is modeled for a student so that it's a strategy that the student can use when they come across difficult text so that they can figure out what the text means. A skill is more of something that a student is able to do automatically to figure out what text means and that they don't have to slow down to think about it anymore. And a strategy is something that they need to apply when something's hard. So with that, I just want to talk about the 4 foundations of literacy instruction within the disciplines. Now, you'll notice that these really align nicely with the 3rd column of the reading framework. So the first one is background knowledge and how that applies into all the subjects. The second one is word study. So how does vocabulary and an analysis of words apply? Looking at the structures. So whether that's a text structure or how a whole form of writing happens. And the last one is to focus on the reading strategies. So what is going on inside the students' heads that is helping them to understand what a text is about, or what's going on inside their heads that's getting in the way of understanding. So in the framework, it's called the metacognitive skills. And so it's within each of these and how all of these come together within one subject that will help build comprehension. And these can all look similar to a degree, but you can get very specific, and there's differences between the subjects as to what changes from one subject to another. And so in later slideshows that are coming up, we're going to approach these more along the lines of what does this look like in math? What does this look like in science? And get a lot more specific so you can see what it can look like for your own subject. Now, for each of those 4 building blocks, we still need to remember to think about before, during, and after. So if I am going to focus on vocabulary for a lesson, what do I do before the student has texts? What do I do while the student has the text in front of them? And what do I do after the student is done reading the text? So the idea of before is, how do I get a student ready to understand at their best what's in the text? During is, what do I get a student to do to be able to think while they read so that they are actively paying attention to understanding and they're actively trying to meet the purpose of why they're reading? And then afterwards is, how do you get them to reflect on it so that they can process what they've learned, be able to summarize it so that they can retain that information to move forward? So these 3 things, the before, during, and after, apply to all of those 4 areas within the foundation of discipline literacy instruction. So just the last discussion today, and I'm not going to come back and wrap anything up after this, but I do want you to have this conversation here. while you're thinking about the idea of those 4 elements within that third column of the framework, think about pre-instruction, during instruction, and after instruction, and think about all the work that you've done with the framework in the past or with literacy instruction in the past, and just think about what can this all look like when it comes together to instruct reading and to instruct kids so that they are successful in the curriculum. Have that discussion for a few minutes, and then we'll wrap that up.